The story begins in 1926, on the mist-laden outskirts of Salem, Massachusetts, where the Winthrop Estate still stands as a husk of forgotten grandeur. Once a mansion of lavish balls, imported marble, and whispered deals among the elite, it now sits hollow, its windows fractured, its gardens overgrown, its very walls sagging with the weight of secrets. To the casual eye, it is merely another ruin, one of countless estates left behind by a fading dynasty. Yet those who linger near its gates feel something far more unsettling than decay. The silence there is not natural. It is oppressive, consuming, a silence that devours even the smallest sound. Birds fall mute as they cross its boundaries. The wind, relentless across the Massachusetts coast, softens inexplicably. Travelers report hear footsteps dulling as if the very earth conspires to hush them. It is a silence that unsettles not only the ears but the mind, like the quiet that precedes a scream which never comes. Between 1926 and 1954, 7 people stepped beyond the estate's threshold and never returned. No bodies, no screams, no traces of struggle. One moment they were there. The next, they were gone, swallowed whole by an absence of sound. Eleanor Marsh, a young pianist. Harold Green, a war veteran scarred but hopeful for peace. Siblings Ruth and Daniel Whitlock, an ambitious journalist. Even a police investigator, each vanished without warning, each reduced to whispers on the lips of townsfolk who feared they might be next. What unsettled investigators most was not just the disappearances, but the lack of evidence. Not a lock broken, not a window shattered, not a single mark upon the ground. Only silence, thick and unyielding, as though the house itself had devoured every trace. For decades, theories clashed like fire against water. Some insisted the disappearances were the work of a cunning predator, a human monster who knew the estate's secrets and used them to hide his crimes. Others claimed that no human hand could erase the sounds of struggle, that the estate was cursed, its silence a living force, a punishment born from the sins of Thomas Winthrop, the ruthless patriarch who built the mansion atop land once rejected by priests. Psychologists spoke of silence as a weapon, a force that could unravel sanity and distort perception. Religious voices argued that silence was the mark of divine retribution, stripping voice and presence from the guilty. And yet, the truth remains elusive. Nearly a century later, the Winthrop Estate endures, its halls cold, its air heavy, its silence intact. Those who dare to enter claim they emerged changed, some shaken, others half-mad, none unscarred. The 7 souls who vanished there remain absent, their stories carried only in fearful whispers and yellowed newsprint. Was it architecture, psychology, or something darker still that fed on their presence? Tonight, we descend into the shadows of the Winthrop Estate, to confront a silence that refuses explanation, and to ask, what truly devoured those 7 lives? The story of the Winthrop Estate cannot be told without first stepping back into the smoke-filled skies and ironclad ambitions of late 19th century New England. Salem, Massachusetts, forever haunted by its reputation from the witch trials 2 centuries prior, was, by the 1870s, a place trying to redefine itself. Gone were the colonial Puritans who saw demons in every shadow. In their place stood industrialists and merchants, men who measured power not by scripture, but by profit margins. Among them rose Thomas Winthrop, a man both admired and feared, whose name would come to shape local history in ways darker than even the trials that scarred the town. Thomas was the son of a shipping magnate, but unlike his forebears, who had been content with modest prosperity, he possessed an appetite for dominance that bordered on obsession. Colleagues described him as a man who entered every room as if it already belonged to him. Revel said his smile was as sharp as a blade, a mask concealing ruthless calculation. By the 1880s, Thomas had expanded the family fortune from shipping into railroads, textiles, and steel. He built factories that smoked day and night, their workers toiling under punishing conditions. Accidents were frequent. Deaths were quietly compensated, if at all. Whispers spread of men crushed beneath machinery, of widows paid in silence, of debts erased by intimidation rather than kindness. Salem's economy flourished under his iron grip, but so too did resentment, murmured interverns and scrawled in letters that never reached the press. The estate itself began in 1889, rising on a tract-of land just outside Salem's northern woods. Locals had avoided the land for generations, claiming it carried a heaviness, a stillness, as if sound itself struggled to take root there. Farmers said livestock balked near its edges that an old parish priest, Father Matthias O'Connell, reportedly refused to bless the ground when asked by Winthrop, remarking cryptically, "There is a void here, Thomas. A silence not of peace, but of absence." "I cannot consecrate absence." Winthrop dismissed the warning with characteristic arrogance, insisting that money and stone would bend the land to his will. What rose was no mere home but a proclamation of power. The Winthrop Estate stretched 3 stories tall, its walls built of imported limestone, its interior adorned with marble staircases, velvet drapes, and chandeliers glittering with gaslight. Guests described the ballroom as cavernous, designed to amplify music and laughter, though curiously some claimed that even during the most raucous parties, sound seemed to falter in the grand hall. A visiting journalist wrote, "The laughter of the revelers seemed muffled, as though it reached my ears through a heavy veil." Whether this was imagination or the first sign of the estate's sinister silence is uncertain, but the remark was quietly noted by locals already suspicious of the house. Thomas Winthrop lived there with his wife, Eleanor, and their 2 children. Eleanor was remembered as a fragile woman, more shadow than presence, who rarely left the estate. Rumor claimed she suffered from a nervous condition, aggravated by the oppressive quiet within the walls. Servants, in hushed tones, spoke of her wandering the corridors at night, whispering to herself, her voice so faint they strained to hear. Some claimed she was speaking not to herself, but to unseen companions. Skeptics dismissed this as gossip designed to dramatize a woman's decline, but the stories persisted. It was during this period that the first tragedies attached themselves to the state. In 1891, a construction accident killed 3 laborers when a support beam collapsed during renovations. Officially, it was deemed negligence, but rumors circulated that the men had complained of hearing faint murmurs the night before, voices urging them to flee. Their families claimed the men were uneasy, reluctant to return to work on the estate. After their deaths, Father O'Connell again spoke out, warning the community that the land itself was cursed. Winthrop retaliated by using his influence to silence the priest, ensuring he was reassigned to a distant parish. The incident faded from public memory, though not from the whispered folklore of Salem's poorer districts. By the turn of the century, Winthrop's empire was at its zenith. He hosted lavish gatherings at the estate, entertaining politicians, businessmen, and foreign dignitaries. Yet beneath the glittering veneer, cracks appeared. His rivals began to vanish not literally, but financially and socially. Business partners found themselves ruined overnight. Debts called in unexpectedly, rumors of scandals planted with surgical precision. Some believed Winthrop orchestrated these downfalls personally, relishing the destruction of anyone who threatened his supremacy. Others claimed darker methods, that he enlisted occult practices whispered about in Boston's hidden circles, where seances and spiritualism mingled with political ambition. Whether these rumors held truth or were the inventions of enemies remains uncertain, but they added to the aura of dread surrounding the man and his home. Psychologists looking back have speculated that Thomas may have suffered from a form of narcissistic pathology, his hunger for control spilling beyond business into the metaphysical. To dominate land, to build on ground others feared, to silence critics by silencing their voices, this was power in its purest form. But where psychology sees pathology, folklore sees curse. The land's silence, already unnatural, may have deepened under his reign, not as coincidence but as consequence. The sins of Thebelder became absorbed into the soil, the stones, the very air. The decline of the Winthrop line came swiftly and mercilessly. In 1908, Eleanor was found dead in her chambers. Officially, it was deemed pneumonia. Thousand servants whispered she had suffocated in her sleep, her face contorted as if pressing against invisible hands. Within a decade, both children were gone as well, one to illness, the other to a riding accident on the estate grounds. By 1919, Thomas stood alone in the cavernous halls, a patriarch with no heirs. He died in 1921, collapsing in the study where he had signed countless contracts and ruined countless lives. Strangely, the butler who discovered him claimed the body was cold, though he had spoken to Winthrop only an hour before. More unsettling, the grandfather clock in the study had stopped at the precise moment of his death, its pendulums ring silently though frozen. After Thomas's death, the estate fell into neglect. Attempts to sell it failed repeatedly. Buyers backed out without explanation, some claiming an overwhelming unease, others reporting strange auditory disturbances, whispers in empty rooms, footsteps in vacant halls, entire conversations hard through walls that contained only silence. A caretaker hired in 1923 lasted only 3 months, quitting abruptly after, claiming he woke nightly to the sensation of someone standing at his bedside, watching in silence. He left Salem altogether, never to return. It is here, in this liminal space between grandeur and ruin, that the estate's legend solidified. Folklorists began to weave tales connecting the land's silence to Salem's older history. Some suggested the estate had been built over ground once used for executions during the witch trials, though no records confirmed this. Others claimed it sat atop a native burial site, the silence being the voice of the forgotten remembrance. Neither theory holds historical weight, yet both endure, illustrating how myth fills the gaps where fact fails to satisfy. Psychology and religion once again collide in interpreting these origins. Was the silence merely an acoustic anomaly, a product of architecture and environment, heightened by the human tendency to find meaning in absence? Or was it a spiritual void, a punishment born of hubris, a scar left by Winthrop's sins and the priest's refusal to consecrate? The human mind seeks patterns, but in the Winthrop estate, those patterns remain blurred, defying certainty. By the time the first official disappearance occurred in 1926, the stage was already set. The house was no longer a home, but a hollow monument to a man whose power outlived his body, a man whose hunger for control may have opened doors better left sealed. Whether the silence was a product of human psychology or a supernatural inheritance, one fact remains: the estate was marked long before the first victim vanished. Its origins were steeped in ambition, arrogance, and whispered warnings ignored. And so, the Winthrop estate passed from history into legend not as a ruin of stone, but as a vessel obsolescence, an emptiness that would soon demand a heavier price than mere whispers. In the autumn of 1926, Salem was cloaked in the kind of seasonal melancholy that always seems to arrive with October. The leaves turned crimson and gold, the nights stretched longer, and with them came whispers of old fears resurrected from the past. It was in this season that the Winthrop estate claimed its first victim, a young woman named Eleanor Marsh, whose name would echo for decades in Salem's haunted folklore. Her disappearance was not just a tragedy. It was the spark that transformed an abandoned mansion into something far darker. It marked the beginning of a series of vanishings that remain unsolved to this day, each carrying the same signature, silence so absolute it mocked reason. Eleanor Marsh was 19 years old, a girl described by her peers as gentle, reserved, and quietly talented. Her gift was the piano, an instrument she played with such skill that neighbors would open their windows when she practiced, letting her music spill across the street like a benediction. She had been offered a chance to audition for a conservatory in Boston, And though she feared Thessady's enormity, she carried dreams larger than Salem's narrow lanes could contain. For her, music was bothscape and identity, a way of carving beauty from an otherwise ordinary life. That is why, when her name came forever bound to the Winthrop Estate, the tragedy felt even sharper, a portrait of innocence pitted against a force of unspeakable menace. On the night of October 17th, Eleanor had been with a small group offerings, all young people restless for excitement in a town where the shadows seemed to offer more entertainment than the streets themselves. They had been telling ghost stories, egging one another on with tales of the estate's strange silence, of Father O'Connell's warning decades earlier, of Eleanor Winthrop's supposed madness within those very walls. The Marsh girl, though timid, was not immune to pride. When one boy dared her to step inside the estate and play a song on the long-abandoned grand piano said to still stand in the room, she hesitated only a moment before agreeing. She told her companions she would prove the estate was nothing but an empty shell, a house whose only power came from rumor and neglect. Her words, though brave, were reportedly spoken with a tremor that suggested she did not entirely believe them. At 9:30, by thewing light of lanterns and a rising October moon, Eleanor crossed the threshold of the Winthrop Estate. Her friends, too frightened to accompany her, remained outside, promising to wait until they heard her music echo from within. The house, though decaying, was still imposing, its door swollen with damp but not locked, its interior draped in cobwebs and dust, its air heavy with the weight of long disuse. According to her friends' latter testimonies, Eleanor moved with hesitation into the darkened halls, her lantern casting fleeting shadows across portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow her every step. Minutes later, the sound came. At first faint, then rising in clarity, the notes of a piano drifted from the mansion's depths. The friends outside swore that Eleanor's playing was unlike anything they had heard before. It was her style, her touch, but the melody was foreign, haunting, composed of chords that felt at once mournful and oppressive. Some described it as if the house itself had chosen the music, using her hands as its instrument. The song swelled, lingered, and then, without warning, cut off mid-phrase. Silence fell, a silence deeper and sharper than before, as though the world itself had inhaled and refused to exhale. Alarmed, the group rushed inside. They followed the echo, or rather, the absence of echo, into the grand ballroom. There, illuminated by the thin beam of Eleanor's abandoned lantern, sat the grand piano. Its lid was raised, the ivory keys dusted but warm to the touch. As though played only moments earlier, the bench still bore the impression of her weight. And yet Eleanor herself was gone. No footprints marred Thedist on the floor. No doors stood open. No windows broken. The house was empty, save for the muted ticking of a clock whose chimes had long since ceased. Sheriff William Daniels, a man not prone to hysteria, led the subsequent investigation. He interviewed each of the friends separately, noting their stories matched with uncanny precision. The playing of the strange melody, the abrupt silence, the warm piano. Search parties combed the estate for days, examining every corridor, every boarded room, every cellar. They found nothing. Dogs brought to sniff her scent whimpered and refused to enter the house. Theories quickly abounded. Had she run away, using the dare as cover? Had she been abducted by a lurking criminal? Had she fallen into some hidden passage or shaft within the house? Each explanation faltered against the evidence. There were no signs of struggle, no alternative footprints, no physical disturbances at all. The absence of evidence became, in itself, the most terrifying evidence of all. Psychologists who revisited the case years later proposed that the silence of the estate might have been weaponized against her. Silence, after all, can disorient, distort time, and create auditory hallucinations. Eleanor may have imagined she was playing when in fact she wandered deeper into the house, confused until she found some hidden place from which she could not escape. But even these rational theories could not explain the testimony of her friends, who all swore they heard the music together, each describing some alien melody, a song none of them could reproduce after the fact. Her mother, devastated by the loss, insisted until her death that Eleanor's spirit lingered. Neighbors reported that on quiet nights, when the wind deepened, the town seemed hushed. Faint piano notes could be heard drifting from the direction of the estate. Investigators dismissed these accounts as grief-induced hallucination, the mind's cruel way of filling absence with hope. Yet too many unrelated witnesses claimed the same thing, a soft, mournful melody rising from the woods, fading into silence before it could be fully recognized. Religious voices in Salem interpreted Eleanor's disappearance as the fulfillment of Father O'Connell's original warning. The priest had spoken of a void, a silence not of peace but of absence, and here was proof, they argued. Eleanor, pure and innocent, had been taken as the first offering to a force that demanded silence as tribute. Others in the community whispered of older curses, that the land was marked by blood spilled unjustly in Salem's darker chapters, and Eleanor had simply been the first to wander into its grasp at the right moment. Skeptics, meanwhile, pointed to more humane explanations. Perhaps she had staged her escape, weary of small-town expectations. Perhaps one of the friends had orchestrated her disappearance, a crime buried under the hysteria of supernatural blame. Sheriff Daniels pursed these angles relentlessly, but with no body, no suspect, and no evidence, the case stalled. Eleanor Marsh was officially declared missing, presumed dead, though no one in Salem truly believed the case was closed. The disappearance ignited fear in the town. Parents forbade their children from approaching the estate. Rumors spread like wildfire, each more elaborate than the last. Some claimed Eleanor's reflection could still be glimpsed in the estate's shattered windows. Others said her laughter echoed faintly in the halls when the moon was full. A few even claimed the house had gained a new portrait overnight, an indistinct painting in the grand ballroom that bore a resemblance to Eleanor, though smeared and blurred as if painted by unseen hands. This was how the Winthrop Estate transformed from a decaying relic of a bygone industrialist into a nexus of terror. The Marsh disappearance became the cornerstone of its legend, the first stone in a wall of mystery that would only grow higher with time. Innocence had entered the house and never returned. Music had blossomed for a moment, then died into silence too profound to comprehend. In later years, scholars, criminologists, and paranormal investigators would all return to Eleanor's case, dissecting every detail. Some emphasized the psychology, a girl pressured into bravery beyond her nature, overwhelmed by silence and fear. Others leaned toward the supernatural, pointing to the pattern of subsequent disappearances that followed the same unnerving template. No one could explain the music. No one could account for the warm piano keys. No one could say why silence had consumed her so completely. Eleanor's disappearance left Salem scarred, its people divided between rational doubt and superstitious dread. Her story continues to haunt the town, not merely because she vanished, but because she seemed to dissolve into nothingness, leaving behind no scream, no struggle, not even the echo of a final note. It was as if the Winthrop Estate itself had claimed her, swallowing her into its hollow lungs, silencing her forever. And though more would vanish in the years to come, it is Eleanor Marsh's name that lingers most vividly in local memory, the girl who played the piano in a haunted house and was never seen again. The disappearance of Eleanor Marsh in 1926 had left Salem reeling, but many still hoped it was an isolated tragedy, a case of youthful recklessness gone awry, not the beginning of something larger. That hope was short-lived. Over the next 3 decades, 6 more individuals would vanish within or around the Winthrop Estate, each disappearance echoing Eleanor's in its inexplicable silence and lack of physical evidence. What began as whispers and fearful caution transformed into a chronic dread that spanned generations. Each new vanishing deepened the estate's legend, weaving a tapestry of horror, that seemed to defy time itself. The victims were not connected by blood, wealth, or vocation. They were bound only by their decision, or perhaps compulsion, to step into the decayed halls of the Winthrop property. And like Eleanor, once they crossed the threshold, they never turned. The second victim came in 1928, 2 years after Eleanor's disappearance, and he was far from a novice teenager testing his courage. Samuel Sam Harker was a decorated veteran of the Great War, a man hardened by the trenches of France and celebrated locally for his bravery. He had returned to Salem to live quietly, but stories of Eleanor's fate stirred something in him. Some said it was guilt, that as a soldier he could not bear to see a young girl's disappearance unsolved. Others believed it was his stubborn refusal to bow to superstition. On an August night, Harker entered the Winthrop Estate, lantern in one hand, revolver in the other. Witnesses recalled that he had promised to settle the matter once and for all. Hours passed with no sound from within. At dawn, a group of townsmen mustered the courage to search for him. Inside, they found the revolver lying on the room floor, its barrel still gleaming as though recently polished, but no sign of Harker himself. The weapon cylinder remained loaded. His boots, coat, and even the cigar he had been chewing were absent. It was as though had disintegrated, leaving only the cold instrument of war behind. The shock of Harker's disappearance spurred Sheriff Daniels to act with more intensity. The estate was inspected once again, with carpenters and builders brought in to look for secret tunnels or unstable flooring. They tapped walls, measured foundations, and probed beneath staircases. No hidden chambers were discovered. The structure, while weakened in places, offered no void large enough to swallow a man whole. Daniels, already disillusioned by the Marsh case, became withdrawn, unable to reconcile his training in evidence with the absence of it. For the first time, Salem's lawmen began, whispering privately of forces beyond their comprehension. 3 years later, in 1931, the Winthrop Estate claimed 2 victims at once. Siblings Margaret and David Klein, aged 22 and 24, were adventurous spirits, children of a wealthy merchant family who treated the estate's infamy as an amusing challenge. They entered together one spring afternoon, determined to debunk the superstition. According to their chauffeur, who waited outside in the car, they had brought sandwiches, sketchbooks, and even a gramophone to make an outing of their exploration. Hours passed without their return. The chauffeur, nervous as the sun began to fall, eventually sought help. Searchers found their gramophone in the foyer, needle resting on a silent groove. But no sandwiches, no sketchbooks, and no trace of the Kleins themselves. Their family spent a fortune funding private investigators, but the results mirrored what Salem already knew: nothingness. Even dust on the stair banisters remained undisturbed, as if the siblings had walked into thin air the moment they entered. By now, Theligan of the Winthrop Estate was firmly entrenched. Children whispered of it in the schoolyard, daring neither to approach its gates. Preachers used it as a metaphor for sin, warning that curiosity and arrogance led to ruin. Writers and journalists flocked to Salem, eager to capitalize on the mystery, though few stayed long on Sethi, experienced the oppressive silence firsthand. Accounts emerged from explorers who approached the property only to feel a sudden vertigo, as if the air grew heavy and sound was stripped from their throats. Some described hearing whispers calling their names, pulling them forward with gentle insistence. Those who resisted fled, shaken and pale. Those who followed deeper were never seen again. The estate's fourth record de disappearance occurred in 1937, a chilling reminder that even authority could not tame the silence. Detective Charles Avery, a Boston investigator renowned for his skepticism of the supernatural, was sent by state officials to assist in reviewing the cases. Avery approached the matter with confidence, ridiculing Salem's provincial superstition. He arrived with measuring tools, recording equipment, and a notebook in which he meticulously his every observation. On his third evening at the estate, He set up a small phonograph machine in the room, intending to capture the acoustic properties of the space. That machine was later recovered, needles scratching endlessly against an unbroken groove, but Avery was never seen again. His notebook lay beside it, ending mid-sentence. The silence is not merely followed by a jagged ink blot where the pen seemed to have been yanked from his hand. Forensic experts examined the page for signs of smudging or tearing but found none. The ink blot, they concluded, was abrupt, as if the writer had ceased to exist mid-thought. Avery's case shook the foundations of official denial. A police investigator vanishing during an assignment raised uncomfortable questions for state authorities. Yet despite whispered outrage, no further inquiry was sanctioned. Instead, the estate was quietly marked as off-limits. Signs were posted. Local law enforcement was instructed to dissuade trespassers, though no one dared enforce it too strictly. Everyone knew the silence did not respect authority. If someone was drawn inside, no badge or law could protect them. The fifth disappearance came in 1942, in the midst of the Second World War, when global chaos seemed to eclipse local horrors. Yet the Winthrop Estate did not sleep. This time the victim was a man named Harold Benton, a drifter with little family and few friends. He had been seen loitering near the property, muttering that the house hums at night. Witnesses recalled his odd behavior, pausing mid-step as though listening to something no one else could hear, tilting his head toward the estate as though it whispered directly into his skull. One evening he walked calmly through the front gates and never emerged. His disappearance drew less media attention, given the war's overwhelming news cycle, but to Salem's residents it was proof that the pattern endured. The estate took note only the curious and the bold, but also the vulnerable, those who lacked the strength to resist its pull. The sixth and final disappearance of this grim cycle occurred in 1954, nearly 3 decades after Eleanor Marsh first stepped inside. By then, the estate had become a place of legend, feared by locals and fetishized by outsiders. The victim, Father Joseph Rourke, was a Catholic priest in his late 50s who believed it was his duty to cleanse the property of its curse. He had studied the old accounts of Father O'Connell, who had refused to bless the land in the 1800s, and considered it a moral failing that the church had abandoned its role. Armed with holy water, crucifix, and prayer book, Rourke entered the estate one July morning while parishioners gathered outside to witness what they hoped would be an exorcism. They heard his prayers echo faintly for several minutes, his voice steady, unwavering. Then silence fell. The congregation waited, whispering nervously. Hours passed when finally a few brave souls ventured inside. They found his crucifix lying in the foyer, beads of the rosary scattered across the floor like broken teeth. Rourke himself was gone. By the time of Father Rourke's disappearance, the pattern was undeniable. 7 victims over 28 years, all vanishing without trace, without sound, without even a suggestion of struggle. Forensic analysis had yielded nothing but contradictions. Dust remained settled. Doors remained locked from within. Personal effects revolvers, notebooks, gramophones, crucifixes remained behind, untouched, as if carefully placed to taunt those left behind. The absence of evidence became the evidence, a void so total it mocked every attempt at rational understanding. Skeptics continued to argue for natural explanations. They proposed hidden tunnels, though no architecture subter it. They spoke of unstable flooring concealing deadly pits, though every inspection revealed only solid foundations. Some even suggested criminal opportunists might have staged abductions to perpetuate the legend, though how such criminals could act without leaving footprints, sounds, or even disturbed air remained unanswered. The supernatural explanations, however, gained louder traction. Witnesses described the estate as if it possessed an appetite, drawing individuals toward it through whispers or compulsions, then erasing them utterly. Silence was not absence, believers claimed, but presence, a predator in its own right, suffocating and consuming. By the mid-1950s, Salem was a town permanently altered by fear. Children were told never to speak the marsh girl's name. Couples whispered prayers when passing the estate's gates. Some residents claimed the house had grown darker over the years, its windows reflecting no light, its roofline sagging like a predator shunched back. The disappearances had not merely robbed the community of lives. They had reshaped its psychology. Silence itself became terrifying. Pauses in conversation, breaks in the wind, moments when the night grew still, these were reminders of the void that waited in the woods. The Winthrop Estate had transcended bricks and timber. It had become a symbol of annihilation, an idea that no amount of reason could fully dispel. To this day, the string of vanishings between 1926 and 1954 remains one of the most unnerving unsolved mysteries in New England's history. 7 lives consumed without witness or explanation, each disappearance leaving behind only questions. Was it the land's curse, as Father O'Connell once implied? Was it an architectural anomaly, a labyrinth of secret passages yet undiscovered? Or was it something far older, far hungrier, something that did not merely hide victims but consumed them, body and soul, leaving only silence behind? Silence is among the most ordinary phenomena of human life, and yet it is also among the most terrifying. It accompanies us in sleep, in prayer, in grief. At times it soothes, offering respite from the clamor of the world, balm for the frayed mind. But when silence is prolonged, deepened, stripped of familiar rhythm, it ceases to comfort. It becomes a force of disorientation, a mirror in which the mind begins to fracture. Within the walls of Winthrop Estate, silence was not merely the absence of sound, but a presence, heavy and predatory, like a weight pressing against the ears. Those who dared to stand at its gates spoke of it as if it were alive, an atmosphere that swallowed words before they left the mouth. The question then is whether this silence was a supernatural punishment or a psychological snare, a kind of unintentional experiment in sensory deprivation that unraveled the human mind. Psychologists have long known that silence, when absolute, can distort perception as much as overwhelming noise. In clinical experiments during the 1950s, volunteers placed in soundproof rooms reported strange experiences within hours: phantom footsteps, ringing bells, even voices calling their names. One subject described the silence as a scream so loud it had no sound. The brain, deprived of external input, begins to generate its own. What if the Winthrop Estate functioned as a natural chamber of sensory deprivation, its peculiar architecture absorbing and muffling sound to such a degree that intruders were cast into a psychological void? If so, then Eleanor Marsh's haunting piano melody, or the whispers that drew Harold Benton toward the gates, may not have been supernatural at all, but hallucinatory projections, the mind conjuring sound to fill the void. Yet even this rational explanation does not account for the disappearances themselves. Hallucinations can terrify, but they do not erase bodies. There is another possibility, that silence was not merely a trigger, but a weapon. Certain frequencies, or the absence of them, can cause physical effects: dizziness, nausea, panic. Sonic warfare has explored this in modern times, with sound cannons and infrasonic devices designed to incapacitate without visible harm. Could the Winthrop Estate have produced, naturally or by design, an acoustic environment so oppressive it overwhelmed the senses? Some engineers speculated that its cavernaceals, strange angles, and heavy materials created standing waves or dead spots where sound was canceled out. Anyone caught within such a void would experience profound disorientation, a sense of being swallowed. Fear, confusion, and panic could drive a person deeper into the estate, into corners where accidents or eventsuicide might occur. In this view, silence is not passive but aggressive, not an absence but a pressure. Religious interpretation, however, view silence through a different lens. Throughout history, silence has been tied to the divine and the damned alike. Monks embrace silence as a path to purity, a discipline that strips away distraction and draws the soul closer to God. Yet biblical passages also speak of silence as judgment, a removal of voice, a smothering of presence, an exile into nothingness. The book of Revelation warns of a silence in heaven lasting half an hour, an ominous pause before calamity. For Father Rourke, the priest who vanished in 1954, the estate silence was not a natural phenomenon but a spiritual abyss, a void where God's voice could not be heard. Tohim, silence was evidence not of physics but of punishment, perhaps even demonic possession of the land itself. If words are the vehicle of prayer, then the stripping away of sound is the stripping away of communion, leaving in the isolation. The debate between psychology and theology thus became a battlefield around the estate. Skeptics argued that silence could induce psychosis, and that victims may have harmed themselves or stumbled into unseen hazards. Believers countered that such an explanation diminished the spiritual horror of what was unfolding. They pointed to the patterns: the revolver left pristine, the gramophone needle still moving, the crucifix dropped as if abandoned mid-prayer. These were not the traces of suicides or accidents, they insisted, but of a consuming force. Silence was not the symptom, but the predator itself, devouring flesh as well as sound. The human reaction to silence reveals something essential about our nature. We are creatures of noise, dependent upon rhythm, language, and ambient sound to orient ourselves. Even in sleep, we are soothed by the hum of air, the rustle of leaves, the faint ticking of a clock. Silence strips away these anchors, leaving the brain unmoored. For some, this evokes calm. For others, terror. Psychologists describe this as the auditory void, in which the absence of input forces the brain to invent its own. For those at the Winthrop Estate, the hallucinations of whispers, footsteps, or music may have been the mind's desperate attempt to reintroduce pattern. But what happens when these hallucinations feel external? When the invented voices seem to come not from within, but from the walls themselves? That is when silence ceases to be emptiness and becomes presence, alien, invasive, predatory. Consider the testimony of those who claim to have approached the estate and fled before vanishing. One young man in the 1940s swore that as he stepped onto the grounds, he heard his dead mother calling his name. Another insisted that the silence seemed to respond to his movements, rushing in to smother each step. These may have been hallucinations, or they may have been something darker, the estate using silence as camouflage, as lure, as trap. The duality here, psychological versus supernatural, is precisely what keeps the mystery alive. Science offers an explanation, but religion insists upon something more. The Winthrop Estate also forces us to confront a larger philosophical question. Why do humans fear silence so deeply? Perhaps because it confronts us with mortality. Sound is life, the beat of a heart, the rhythm of breath, the exchange of words. Silence, absolute and suffocating, is indistinguishable from death. To step into the Winthrop Estate was to step into a rehearsal of the grave, to confront the possibility of non-existence. Whether by architecture, acoustics, or curse, the estate created an environment where every visitor was forced to face that abyss directly. Some could not withstand it. Some, perhaps, were taken by it. Religious writers described the estate as a place where God had turned his face away, leaving only void. Psychologists described it as an accidental laboratory of humanterror, a place where sensory deprivation exposed the fragility of the mind. Both perspectives, though opposed, lead to the same conclusion: silence is not neutral. It is active, shaping behavior, warping thought, and in some cases consuming. As the decades passed and the disappearances mounted, the estate became more than a physical location. It became a symbol of silence's power. Salem's townsfolk avoided pauses in conversation, filling the air with chatter as if to ward off the void. Nighttime stillness was dreaded. Children learned to whistle in the dark. In this way, the estate's psychological contagion spread beyond its gates, infecting the town with a collective fear of absence. Silence was no longer emptiness but threat, no longer peace but punishment. The tension between psychology and religion never resolved. Investigators leaned on science, measuring acoustics and searching for structural explanations. Priests and ministers framed the estate as a warning, a modern-day Sodom where arrogance met divine judgment. Neither side could prove its case, because silence left no evidence. It erased footprints, smothered cries, and consumed the very markers by which truth might be measured. The Winthrop Estate thus remained what it always was, a question, an abyss into which 7 souls had vanished. As we leave this section, the psychological and spiritual interpretations collide without conclusion. Was the estate an accidental echo chamber that preyed on human weakness, or was it a place where silence itself had teeth? The answer lies, perhaps, in the testimonies of those few who claimed to have entered and survived. They spoke of voices, shadows, and a silence that followed them home. Some lived to tell their story. Others wished they hadn't. And it is to these survivors that we now turn, in search of a glimpse into what the Winthrop Estate truly holds within its suffocating hush. For all the horror that clung to the Winthrop Estate, for all the souls that slipped into its silence never to return, there remain a few who did not vanish. Their survival offers no comfort, however. If anything, their testimonies deepen the dread. Those who emerged alive did not return whole. They spoke of sensations that defied logic, phantom sounds, suffocating pressure, voices that were not voices but thoughts intruding from without. Their words provide the only first-hand accounts of what it feels like to stand in the belly of that devouring hush, but even these accounts raise more questions than answers. If the estate could consume some, why did it spare others? Was survival a matter of chance, willpower, or design? Each testimony only widened the chasm between explanation and enigma. The earliest known survivor was a teenage boy named William Lawton, who entered the estate in 1934 on a dare, just 3 years after the disappearance of Margaret and David Klein. Unlike Eleanor Marsh, William returned, but not without scars. His friends claimed he had gone silent within minutes of stepping inside, though they could still see him through the doorway. His lips moved as if speaking, but no sound emerged. Terrified, they called to him, but he seemed not to hear. After nearly 10 minutes, William staggered backward out of the house and collapsed on the lawn. When his voice returned, it came as a scream. He later told a doctor that inside the estate, his own heartbeat became unbearable, louder than cannon fire, drowning his thoughts until he felt his skull might crack. No one could explain the physiological cause. Doctors noted elevated blood pressure, but not enough to account for such perception. To this day, William's case is remembered as the first hint that the estate might amplify the body's own sounds, until they became maddening. Another account came in 1948 from a woman named Ruth Adams, who wandered into the estate after drinking heavily at a tavern. Unlike William, Ruth described tactile phenomena rather than auditory. She swore that unseen hands pressed against her ears, pushing inward as though to crush her skull. She clawed at her own head to make it stop, leaving deep scratches on her skin, but found no one behind her. She fled before she could go further inside, and when neighbors found her stumbling into the street, she was trembling and incoherent. Her account reinforced the idea that silence within the estate was not mere absence, but an active force, pressing against perception until it bent or broke. These survivor accounts fueled a spectrum of theories. The scientific explanations leaned toward natural phenomena. One camp suggested underground gases seeping from the marshy soil could induce hallucinations. Methane, carbon monoxide, or other emissions might disorient intruders, creating sensations of pressure, sound, or visions. Yet this theory falters in the face of evidence. No measurable concentrations were ever detected, and gases would not discriminate, sparing some while erasing others. Moreover, gases cannot collect crucifixes neatly on the floor or leave revolvers polished but ownerless. Another scientific theory fixated on infrasound, low-frequency vibrations below the threshold of human hearing. Infrasound has been linked to feelings of dread, panic, and even visual hallucinations. Some suggested the state's design, with its long corridors, high ceilings, and heavy masonry, could have created a resonant environment that amplified such frequencies. A visitor standing in the wrong place at the wrong moment might experience overwhelming sensations of fear or pressure. This theory gained some traction in the 1960s, when researchers studying haunted sites found correlations between infrasound and reports of ghostly activity. Still, infrasound may explain fear, but not disappearance. It can drive a person to madness or flight, but it does not consume. Religious interpretations cast the survivor's words in a darker light. If William Lawton's heartbeat was magnified to unbearable levels, was it not the estate reminding him of his mortality, reducing him to nothing but fragile flesh? If Ruth Adams felt unseen hands crushing her ears, was it not a symbolic stripping away of her ability to hear God's voice? Clergy warned that the estate was enacting a tithe, claiming lives as reparation for Thomas Winthrop's sins. In this reading, survivors were not spared but warned, allowed to leave so that their testimony might amplify fear and respect for the curse. The disappearances, said one priest, were sacrifices 7 souls devoured each generation to sat the hunger of silence. Not all interpretations were spiritual or scientific. Conspiratorial whispers circulated too. Some suggested the disappearances were covered up by local authorities, who sought to protect property values or shield powerful families. Perhaps skeptics argued the estate was a hiding place for criminals, smugglers, or cultists who disposed of trespassers to guard their secrets. A handful of journalists speculated that the Winthrop Estate might have hosted clandestine rituals in its heyday, and that remnants of those gatherings lingered in the form of secret societies using it still. The evidence for such theories was tenuous at best, but they appealed to those who distrusted both science and religion. To them, the silence of the estate was no supernatural predator, but a human conspiracy, cloaked in legend to deter inquiry. One of the most unsettling survivor testimonies came not from a reckless youth or a drunken wanderer, but from a surveyor named Jonathan Keene, who entered the estate in 1951 on official business. He was tasked with assessing the property boundaries for tax records and insisted he would remain only on the periphery. Yet even from the threshold, he reported sensations unlike anything in his professional experience. His own breathing grew thunderous, he said, while the sound of his pencil scratching notes on paper vanished entirely, as though erased by the air. He swore that he saw shadows shift against the far wall. Though no light source explained them, Keene fled before going deeper, but he later confessed to colleagues that he sometimes woke at night to the sound of silence, an absence so profound it drowned his wife's voice, his clocks ticking, even his own pulse. In team, he resigned his post, unable to continue working near the estate. Keene's testimony lends weight to the theory that silence, in extreme concentration, can be contagious. Survivors did not merely describe what they experienced within the estate, they described carrying it home with them, as though silence clung to them like smoke or shadow. This raises a chilling possibility that the estate does not confine its influence within brick walls, but radiates outward, infecting those who come too near. In this interpretation, survivors are not spared at all. They are marked, condemned to live with fragments of the void that devoured others whole. Philosophers and cultural critics also weighed in, pointing to the estate as a reflection of broader fears. In an age when industry was reshaping the world, when machines clattered and voices filled every space, the Winthrop Estate represented the terror of absence, the possibility that all human noise could be snuffed out in an instant. Silence was not peace, but annihilation. Survivors embodied this duality. They lived, yet carried within them the reminder of how fragile the line between presence and absence truly was. As theories multiplied, so too did contradictions. If underground gases were responsible, why were they never measured? If infrasound explained the dread, why did some experience tactile sensations or visions? If spiritual punishment demanded lives, why were some spared? If it was a human conspiracy, why leave such neat and inexplicable evidence behind? Each explanation, when pursued, collapsed under scrutiny. And so the silence endured, not only as a phenomenon, but as a question. The most haunting theory, perhaps, is the simplest: that the estate itself is alive, that silence is its voice and hunger combined. Survivors are those it toyed with, those it tested and discarded. The disappearances are no accidents or punishments, but feedings, the estate sustaining itself by consuming life in intervals too precise to dismiss. The priest who called the vanishings a tithe may have been closer to truth than he realized. In this framework, theories of gas, infrasound, or cults are distractions. The estate does not need accomplices. It is predator enough. Survivors like William Lawton and Ruth Adams rarely spoke publicly in later years. Both lived quiet lives, haunted by what they had endured. Lawton avoided conversation about the estate altogether, though neighbors noted his aversion to silence, his habit of filling rooms with radios or mechanical clocks. Adams drank heavily until her death, her nights filled with restless pacing, as if afraid of stillness. They were not merely witnesses. They were casualties spared only in part, marked by silence that followed them to the grave. By the time the last official disappearance occurred in 1954, the town of Salem had ceased to search for answers. Too many theories, too many contradictions, too much absence. The estate remained a question that swallowed evidence as easily as it swallowed people. Survivors offered glimpses but no resolution. Science faltered, faith strained, conspiracies frayed. What endured was silence, heavy, patient, unyielding. And perhaps that is the final truth, that the Winthrop Estate resists categorization because it is not meant to be solved. Its silence is not a puzzle, but a condition, one that reveals more about human fear than about itself. Theories, whether of gas, frequency, sin, or conspiracy, are attempts to impose meaning where none exists. The estate and its silence are reminders that some voids are not meant to be filled. Survivors remind us not of what is possible to endure, but of how thin the margin of survival truly is. Nearly 100 years have passed since the first recorded disappearance at the Winthrop Estate, yet the house remains, standing like a wound that refuses to close. Its windows gape across the tangled undergrowth, glass long gone, frames blackened with rot. The gardens have surrendered to weeds, roots splitting the stone pathways, ivy clawing at the walls, but what unnerves visitors most is not what they see, it is what they do not hear. Birds skirt the grounds. Insects avoid the air above it. Even the wind seems to lose courage when approaching the gates. The silence is still there, clinging like an aura, and that silence is what has elevated the estate from forgotten ruin to legend. Locals pass quickly when traveling the road nearby, unwilling to look directly at the house, as though eye contact alone could summon misfortune. Tourists arrive in cautious clusters, snapping hurried photographs from a distance before retreating. Paranormal investigators sometimes venture closer, lugging cameras and microphones, hoping to capture proof of the supernatural. Many return shaken, their recordings riddled with gaps where sound should exist. A whispered sentence disappears midway, the buzz of equipment drops into nothingness, and even heart monitors occasionally flatline for seconds at a time before zooming. No technical fault has ever fully explained these anomalies. The 7 who vanished between 1926 and 1954 remain absent, their names etched into the folklore of Salem: Eleanor Marsh, Margaret and David Klein, the war veteran, the investigator, the two unnamed drifters. Their families carried grief without closure, and their absence became a permanent shadow over the community. For every skeptic who insists the disappearances were staged runaways, accidents, or crimes concealed by opportunists, there are others who swear the estate itself is responsible. To them, the silence is no mere absence of sound but an active force, a predator disguised as stillness, patient and hungry. Theories abound, each offering a shard of explanation but never a complete answer. Science points to infrasound, hallucination, or toxic gases. Religion invokes curses, divine judgment, and the sins of Thomas Winthrop's ruthless life echoing through stone and soil. Conspiracists argue for cults, hidden tunnels, or government cover-ups. Yet no theory explains why the silence persists even long after the disappearances ceased. No theory accounts for why animals avoid the grounds, why survivors carry fragments of that hush with them for the rest of their lives, or why sound itself seems to falter within its walls. And so the question lingers, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Is the Winthrop Estate merely an abandoned ruin, its tragedies amplified by rumor? Or is it something darker, a void in the fabric of the world, a hunger that waits behind walls and gardens disguised as silence? Nearly a century later, the truth remains hidden, muffled, swallowed whole. The estate still waits, listening. The only question that matters now is simple. If you were to step inside, would you ever come back out?